This video is a criticism of the NASA video, Moon Machines, the navigation computer. It shows problems it contains. The video begins with a demonstration of the inertial guidance system of Charles Draper. An inertial guidance system is based on the gyroscope principle, the same principle which allows you not to fall when you ride a bicycle. The first initial guidance systems were quite bulky. In his demonstration, Draper shows that the trajectory of a plane which has been deviated by winds can be automatically corrected by the guidance system. The guidance system which was embarked in Apollo was not as bulky as the one Draper used for his first demonstration, for the latter would have been too big and heavy for Apollo. The size of the inertial guidance systems have made much progress since the era of Apollo, and they have been much reduced in size for a still greater precision. Initially, the guidance systems were controlled by analog computers. Analog computers don't use the digital technology. They consist of an assembly of operational amplifiers which does a very specific task. The way that the operational amplifiers are interconnected represents in some way the program of the analog computer. Aerospace engineer students were using analog computers and programming the simulation of the flight of a plane by connecting with wires outputs of operational amplifiers to inputs of other operational amplifiers. The wiring was representing the program of the analog computer. Analog computers are especially well adapted to control the flight of planes. A hybrid computer is an analog computer coupled with a digital computer, as an analog computer uses analog, continuously varying data, and a digital computer uses digital discrete data. They need analog to digital and digital to analog converters to communicate with each other. Hybrid computers started to appear when computers started to become more compact. In the 70s, a hybrid computer could be used to simulate the flight of a missile. The analog computer is then programmed by wiring, and the digital computer by punch cards. But the task to do in Apollo was so complex that an analog computer was insufficient to do it, and that a digital computer was needed. And here comes the AGC that it was in charge of developing. The commentator of the video says that the computers of that time were quite bulky and that, even when they were reliable, they were quite slow compared with the current computers. But it also was the case for the AGC, perhaps less bulky than the big computers but just as slow. David Mindel says that the MIT team who developed the AGC innovated by giving different priorities to the tasks instead of giving the same priority to each of them. Effectively, the tasks the AGC had different priorities, as this table shows. But it's not the AGC which invented the priority of tasks, for other computers like the IBM 1800 were also able to use different priorities for the tasks as soon as 1964. In the video they show Margaret Hamilton, the only woman of the AGC development team, before a huge pile of listings. Oh really? Did the AGC code need so many program lines? NASA has shown an excerpt of the listing. It holds on 7 pages, and the comment of the listing says that the part of the program which is shown takes 6860 bits in memory, in the core rope memory, that averagely makes 980 bits per page. The core rope memory, let's suppose for a moment that it was working with containing 589,824 memory bits. If we divide it by 980, we obtain a result equal to 601.86. Otherwise said, the program which is encoded in the core rope memory holds in around 600 pages. It is an estimation. It may be a little more or a little less, but it should not be far from it. This is a listing of 1000 sheets, so it should be more than enough to contain the whole program of the AGC. So why were they using that much listing to write the code of the AGC? Analyses announces that the memory of the AGC was equivalent to 72 kilobytes. That's right, each memory module was containing 256 cores that 192 sense wires could pass through, and was so allowing to program 256 by 192 equals 49152 bits, which makes 49152 divided by 8 equals 6144 bytes. There were 12 rope modules in the AGC, 2 rows of 6, which makes a total of 6144 by 12 equals 7378 bytes. In fact, the memory unit of the AGC was a 16-bit word, so it was making a total of 36864 memory words. This, of course, supposing that this memory was actually working. Analyses does not look like happy when he announces the size of the memory of the AGC. He looks like he had a tooth extracted. Analyses has written an article about the AGC, tells about the Apollo Guidance computer. That is quite amusing when you have some competence and you read it. In fact, it is nothing but a collection of jokes which has been explained in a video, AGC in Wonderland. These jokes are obvious clues that the missions were fake. In the 60s, the operating system of the big computers was read from magnetic tapes, which was a quite low process. It was not possible to use this process in Apollo, not only because it was bulky, but also because it was not safe enough. The tape might have had a problem, which was not acceptable, and the loading process was too slow. That's why the operating system and the program of the AGC were contained in a new type of fixed memory, the core rope memory. The core rope memory consists of wires passing through ferrite cores or bypassing them. A wire passing through a core represents 1 for this core, and a wire bypassing it represents 0 for this core. The concept is that when 2 wires go through a ferrite core, when a pulse is sent into one of the wires, a pulse can be sensed in the other wire passing through the core. The second wire then represents bit set to 1. When the second wire bypasses the core instead of passing through it when a pulse is sent into the first wire, no pulse can be read in the second wire which bypasses the core. The second wire then represents bit set to 0. Notice that this principle can also be used the other way. The bit wire may not be the sense wire, but the activation wire instead. When the bit wire bypasses the core and a pulse is sent into the bit wire, no pulse will be sensed in the wire which remains inside the core, and the test will then know that the bit wire represents 0 for this core. Core rope memories were also used in other computers, notably in computers embarked on ships which were requiring that the operating system could be loaded very fast. The right photo of this telescopic view represents the core rope memory of an anomalies which of course actually worked. The left photo represents a view of the so-called core rope memory of the AGC. However, there is a major difference between these two core rope memories. On the AGC the bit wires were sense wires, while on the anomalies there were activation wires instead. The data was not directly read on the bit wires, which were passing through cores or bypassing them, but on unique sense wires which were attached to the cores. That does not mean that it was not possible that the memory of the AGC could have worked with the bit wires used as sense wires, but this memory was accumulating inexcusable defaults which were preventing it from working. These defaults have been described in the video The Sunset of the AGC. One of these defaults is that some cores were receiving to inhibit currents instead of a single one in the example they show. But it was not the only default. There also were too many sense wires which were enabled to receive a pulse, thus dividing as much the current of the pulse at such point that it could not be read anymore. This telescopic view shows, on the right, the bit amplifier of the core rope memory of Apollo, and, on the left, the bit amplifier of a core rope module of printer character, which actually worked. Now, look at the part which has been framed and read on printer's bit amplifier is called RC circuit, with a resistor and a capacitor, and it allows to convert the pulse on the secondary of the transformer into a temporary permanent current, which then can be read by the reading logic. After the bit was read, a state of the input which has been circled in blue was changed, in order to discharge the capacitor and allow the reading of the next bit. In the X-bit amplifier the circuit is absent, which means that the pulse is not memorized on the secondary of the transformer, and all the transformer does is to transmit the pulse to the amplifier without memorizing it, and as such it is useless. If the pulse is not memorized, it cannot be read by the reading logic, for it passes too fast. As a bonus, the transistor which has been circled in orange on the X-bit amplifier is incorrectly mounted. It is in some way mounted upside down. Even if the pulse was arriving on its input, which it doesn't, it couldn't transmit it on its output. The dynamic memory, the one which could be both read and written in order to contain temporary data, was not better, with also inexcusable defaults, in particular with the write and read circuits sharing a common part, while they are supposed not to touch each other as one acts on the other by induction. Bill Tyndall, executive of NASA, would have found that the MIT team was doing a sloppy job. Examining their programs, he would have found that these programs were containing plenty of repetitions, and were inefficient. Thus he decided that the guidance would not be made by the AGC itself, but directly from the ground by using radio waves. The AGC would only be used as a backup system. The guidance of the powered descent is particularly complicated. The Lunar module starts from a very important orbital speed, 6,000 km/h, from the parking orbit, not the orbit of the command module, but a lower orbit, and first takes the horizontal attitude to decrease the very important horizontal speed. For this horizontal speed creates a vertical force which opposes the lunar attraction, and prevents the lunar module from coming closer to the lunar surface. Progressively, as the horizontal speed decreases, so does the centrifugal force, and so the lunar module starts to turn to a more vertical attitude in order to also counter the lunar attraction before this one makes the lunar module take it to important vertical speed. But this is very progressive, and the attitude of the lunar module remains mostly horizontal for most of the descent. The vertical speed remains moderate, far from the initial horizontal speed. So the guidance of the powered descent is quite complicated, for the lunar module must control both the thrust of the main engine and the attitude of the lunar module, with the lateral thrusters of the RCS. During this descent, the AGC continuously reads the values of the gyroscopes, angles, and accelerometer speeds, to compute, in combination with the desired trajectory, the orders to give to the main engine and the RCS. Every 2 seconds period of the guidance task it updates the commands given to the main engine and the RCS. Making the guidance from the mainframe computers poses a big problem. Indeed, in order to make the calculations, these computers would need the values of the inertial platform, angles and speeds. It would take 1.25 seconds to send the navigation data to us. After having received the navigation data, the mainframe computers would update the commands from these data and would send the computed commands to the lunar module, and it would take another 1.25 seconds to send back the computed commands to the lunar module. So in total, between the moment that the navigation data are sent to us, and the moment that the corresponding commands are received back, there would be at least 2.5 seconds, even if the mainframe computers were making an instantaneous calculation. So they would make less well than the AGC, which has a calculation period of 2 seconds. But it is not the only problem for using the mainframe computers to make the guidance of the powered descent. Indeed, making the guidance from the ground-based mainframe computers would imply that there would never be a lost communication. But it is in fact very hazardous to proceed that way, for there could be a lost communication at any moment. If the LM's antenna was not directed toward the Earth at a given moment, there would be a temporary loss of communication, and thence the mainframe computers could not control the lunar module as long as the communication is lost. It is not acceptable in a so critical descent. That's why making the guidance from the mainframe computers on Earth is an extremely bad idea. The guidance had definitively to be made by the AGC. But the AGC was finally operational, and ready to efficiently guide the lunar module, well in theory. The first test to see whether the AGC was correctly working is when Apollo 8 turned on the hidden side of the Moon, on which there is no possible communication with the Earth. The AGC was then on its own, and could not be helped by the mainframe computers on Earth. Everybody held his breath to see if the AGC would be able to manage this situation. But when the spaceship reappeared on the other side of the Moon, and that communication with the Earth was restored, the spaceship was exactly where it was supposed to be, so the AGC had perfectly worked. Except that in fact the AGC had nothing to do, for the spaceship was then following a natural orbit of the Moon, and so all that the AGC had to do was to let the spaceship follow its natural orbit. Notice that instead of doing nothing, the AGC could have decided to fuck up, and make a maneuver to make the spaceship leave its orbit. So maybe the miracle is that the AGC didn't fuck up, and had understood it had nothing to do. In this context indeed, the AGC perfectly worked. In this video there is an obvious clue which has been given by Donellis. He said this: you can always make something run quicker if you have more space to write it. Any programmer knows that the shorter a program is, and the faster it will run. And generally a programmer will try to write the shortest and most compact program as possible, not to save memory space, but to make it run as fast as possible. You can repeat an instruction loading the accumulator from a same value, or an instruction storing the accumulator into a same date. You'll obtain a program running the same as the program without useless repetitions, but running slower. If instead of saying it you have more space to write it, he had said instead if you make it run on a faster processor, then it would have made sense. And precisely in the code of the AGC, many useless repetitions can be noticed. So it seems obvious that what Don L has said is a clue he is giving of the hoax, but this clue has gone unnoticed by most people. Then comes the major problem of the powered descent of Apollo 11, the famous alarm 1202 which startled the astronauts, and about which they asked information to the ground. The ground itself was knowing nothing about this alarm, and yet this alarm is a very important alarm. If there was an alarm that the ground should have been aware of, it was that one. But an engineer, Jack Garman, could give the clue to this alarm. He found this alarm in the list of alarms. There was a big unresolved question though. Would this alarm compromise the rest of the mission? But finally this alarm found its explanation. It would result from a checklist error concerning the radar input. The computer would have reacted exactly like it had been configured. It was not its fault. It was the fault of the incorrect checklist. So all is well that ends well. It would have been embarrassing if it had been the fault of the AGC itself. That's right, the AGC had reacted as configured. The astronauts had been instructed to put a radar switch on the slew position and disposition of the switch was making that the radar input of the AGC was receiving fake fast radar pulses instead of the slow normal radar pulses. It's not a supposition, it's explicitly said in the mission report of Apollo 11. If the radar pulses had been counted with electronic counters like it is made in all the normal guidance systems, including the one of the Saturn rocket, it would not have had a negative influence on the behavior of the AGC, except that it could have seen that the count of pulses was abnormally high. But the AGC had been configured so that its processor will directly count the radar pulses with dedicated instructions. Consequently, each time the AGC was executing a counting instruction, it was not executing an instruction of the guidance program. The result is that the AGC lacked time to execute the guidance task, and instead of finishing the guidance task in the allotted time of 2 seconds, it was going over this time, thus accumulating the delays leading to its crash, and the appearance of the alarm 1202. So yes, the AGC had normally reacted to the checklist error instructing to put the radar mode on the slew position. Now I'm asking you, what is 1. Creating a condition for the AGC to crash? 2. Creating a situation for this condition to happen? What do you call that? I don't know what you call that, but personally, I call that intentional sabotage. Margaret Hamilton was very worried about the alarm 1202. The engineers absolutely had to find what it was about. It was vital for the success of the mission. Sure, the engineers had to know the origin of a problem that they had themselves intentionally created. It's natural to be worried about a problem that you intentionally create yourself. The mood of someone can be read on his face. If he is happy, he will show a happy face, and if he is sad, he will show a sad face. One can lie, but the lie will show on his face, even if he is not aware of it. Observe the face of the MIT engineers in the video. Most of the time they show dramatic faces, even if now and then they manage to produce a strained smile. They look stressed. They look like the astronauts would have crashed and died on the moon instead of successfully landing on it. They should show radiant, happy faces for having allowed a great exploit to happen. The only one who looks relaxed is David Mindell, but Mindell does not belong to the time of Apollo, and he does not have the competence to see the problems of the AGC. He really believes that men walked on the moon. It is impossible for the MIT engineers to talk out. All they can do is to give them direct clues, and John Ellis has given many of them. It must be very painful for them to keep the secrecy over what is the biggest hoax in history. And if the lie does not show on the face of the astronauts, it is for a very simple reason. It is because they really believe they have walked on the moon, not because they have really walked on the moon, but because they have been suggested they did. They all have been submitted to the mind control program of the CIA, MKULTRA, and these photos extracted from the last magazine of Apollo 17 support this assertion. You may wonder how the CIA doctors could control the astronauts if they were in space. In fact, that's their whole point. They never were in space. Indeed, they were seen entering the Saturn rocket, but before the rocket lifted off, they were put to sleep, secretly extracted from the rocket and put into a simulation cabin in which they could believe they were flying to the moon. Thereafter, they were taken in charge by the CIA doctors who applied to them the mind manipulation program, MKULTRA, they previously illegally tested on soldiers and prisoners. But if the astronauts do not directly say they did not walk on the moon and do not betray on their faces they didn't, they indirectly say it by repeating all the nonsense which has been suggested to them by the NASA engineers when they were in a hypnotic sleep. A video has been made to show this nonsense, incoherent declarations of the Apollo astronauts. An example. In the movie, In the Shadow of the Moon, Buzz said that he took the time that Armstrong was descending on the surface of the moon to urinate so that he would not be bothered with it later. Their suit indeed had a urine collection device, but this would have made sense only if he had used the urine collection device of the Lunar module, otherwise he would immediately have been bothered by the product of his urine. But he could not have used the urine collection device, the LM, for the simple reason that the void was made in the Lunar module before the first astronaut got out, for the hatch had no intermediate chamber. So Buzz had to wear his spacesuit before Armstrong descended to the lunar surface, which means that he necessarily had to use the urine collection device of his suit while Armstrong was descending, what he could also have done on the moon. All this does not prevent most people from believing that the AGC is a marvelous computer which allowed men to land and walk on the moon.